Hi guys, thanks so much for all the responses after the podcast. One of the key questions I got was, you talk about being in zone 2 or zone 3, say for a marathon, but I was able to run at 93% of my max heart rate. How can that be? So I just want to explain the zones as I see them. When I talk about zones, they're based on your lactic threshold. Okay, so they're based on how much lactate is in your body, and we're going to talk about how that works in a second. You might have heard of a lactic threshold test. One common myth is that this is out of reach for non-elite athletes. This is only for professionals or elite athletes. That's not the case. The tests are not that expensive. They're usually about $100 to maybe $200. You need a heart rate monitor, and it's best to do it on a treadmill, but you can do it outside as well. You'll like, I've done them in the past. Just with my background, I don't do many now, but if you're in Ireland, I can recommend people who do them. Or as I said, just look up lactic threshold tests. You'll find somewhere quite easy, and I would really recommend it. If you get it done one time, you'd have it for life. So I'm just going to explain how it occurs. Okay, so let's go here first. Right, so let's see how it looks. So what happens is you start at a slow pace. This is a quite quick pace here. The person runs with their heart rate strap on. You get their heart rate at the pace they're running. The person runs for, say, 3 minutes. It can be up to 6 minutes. Once in the last, say, 5 seconds, you take their heart rate. If they step off, you take a little piece of, you prick their ear. You can also do their finger. And you take a little bit of blood. That goes onto a lactic analyzer. A tiny bit. I'll show another video in a second. The person then continues, and then we increase the pace on the treadmill by 1 kilometer. Okay, so that's all there is to it. She'll now run for another, say, 3 minutes to 6 minutes, depending on how you're doing the test, at that harder pace. There's key things that you're looking for. One is what their heart rate was when you asked them just before they stepped off. What RPE they were at, like was it a 5 out of 10, 6 out of 10? It gives them a general sense. And then what was the speed that they did it at? Okay, so that's the first. I'm just going to show one other test here. Here's just a little bit of a closer insight. As you can see, he stepped off, just squeeze there. You take that tiny bit of blood into that analyzer here, and then he'll step back on the treadmill, and he's running quite quickly. He's nearly finished. Okay, so that's just basically how it is. It's just 3-minute intervals, increasing the pace with your lactic analyzer. Now, what's going on? So as we run, that was our lactic analyzer. Sorry, no. There we go. Okay, so as we run, you're going to start increasing your breathing rate. Okay, so there's 2 main systems. There's actually 3, but the other one's not important at the moment. We'll just call them aerobic and anaerobic. The aerobic system, we know we use oxygen. We can use it for a lot longer of a distance, and there's no buildup of, say, what people call lactic acid, which is really lactate and H+ ions. Basically, what happens is that when that person gets on the treadmill, they start running. They'll start breathing heavier, which is basically using their oxygen system more. So when that person was on the treadmill, after the first one, their lactic would have been at a baseline level, usually below 1. On the next one, if you've done it correctly, on the next few, they'll still be at baseline level. Now, their heart rate will have gone up, their breathing will be harder, but they'll still be not producing lactic because they are at 100% aerobic here. And at 100% aerobic, there is no lactic because you aren't using any anaerobic. And anaerobic, lactate is a byproduct of anaerobic energy production. It's like if you have a hybrid car. If you have a hybrid car, if you're using 100% electric, there's no petrol being used. So on the dash, if you were trying to work out, say if the dash was broken, you're like, how much was battery, how much was petrol. Well, if you could constantly check what the petrol level is like, that no gas has been used, well, then you know it's 100% the battery that's been used. And it's the same in our bodies. If there is no increase in the lactate in the body, well, that means that it's 100% aerobic. Okay, so generally that is recovery pace. Now we'll go through the paces as well, but that's recovery pace essentially, because there's no build-up. At some stage, it'll fluctuate slightly, but at some stage there's a spike. There's a tiny spike in the lactic. That sometimes is called the lactic threshold, or aerobic threshold. So what's happened there is you're still breathing, you're working, your heart rate's going up, you're breathing heavier, but as you increase the pace on the treadmill or on your run, there is at some point where you also involve the anaerobic system slightly. And that you can see here that person will say 100. You could argue here that they're not 100 because it's slightly gone up, but here's a definite spike in the lactate. Now, some people wait till the spike goes above 1.5 on the millimoles, which is basically occurred there. Okay, so because there's a rise in your blood lactate, so when we're taking that little pinch of blood, there's some lactate in that blood. That indicates now that some proportion of the speed and energy is coming from anaerobic. It'd be like if your car now, say the battery is 90% driving it, but 10% is also with the petrol engine. Okay, so we're still a lot aerobic here. Now, as we continue, more and more for that increased speed, more and more of that comes from anaerobic sources. Okay, so we could still be a little bit efficient with our oxygen, but as we go more and more here, say if this was like, say if we just said here because it's slightly spiked, so say that's 95% aerobic, 5% anaerobic. Here, if we said maybe 85% aerobic, 15% anaerobic. I'm just making up the figures, but you'll get what I mean. Here now it's gone to say 70% or 50-50. Maybe like more like 70 or 80%, 20% anaerobic. Generally at 4 millimoles, or when there's this, I'll just move myself out of the way. See where there's a big spike? It goes shooting up. That is either called the anaerobic threshold, or that's what generally people mean by their lactic threshold. That's generally about like 80, that would feel about 80% intensity. Usually that's at 85%. I know Jonathan, who put the comment, he said that he was able to run a marathon at 93% of his max heart rate. I would just imagine he's a developed aerobic system, probably because he doesn't have the running capacity to run harder. I could be wrong there, but basically that's generally 85%. I imagine for Jonathan, he was able to run roughly at 93% of his max heart rate. So that'll vary for each person. The heart rates you have will vary. So that's why it's important to get the test, because everyone's different. My heart rate is very high as well. So when at my lactic threshold, my heart rate's about 182 beats. So that is very high for say an 80-85% effort, and that doesn't feel hard. It feels like 8 out of 10. As I said on the thing, I could say a line. I have friends who are at the same level as me, and their lactic threshold is like 161 beats. So if we were going off our different heart rates, it just wouldn't work. Okay, so when it comes past this point, any increase in speed or effort is 100% anaerobic. That's where I was talking about you need to train aerobically. So if you train here, you're going to be training predominantly aerobic. If you train above this, you're training predominantly anaerobic sources. Okay, so that's important, because that's where we're saying that if you train above 4 millimoles, really what you're training, you are generating a lot of lactic acid then in your bloodstream and in your body. So what you're really doing then is you're training your ability to tolerate lactic. You are not training your ability to stay aerobic, which is what we want. Okay, so I hope that makes sense of what a lactic test is. God, we're 10 minutes in already. Okay, here's another one that might look similar. This person is very good at their at the recovery pace, and they're probably not doing enough work in what I would call zone 2. So my zone 2 generally is from 1.5 to 2.5, and then my zone 3 is from kind of 2.5 to like 3, and then or 3.5, and then the zone 4 will be lactic threshold, which would be around the 4 millimoles, depending on the person. You see the way they've spiked already? This would be lower for this person. Oh, sorry. But this would be lower for this person. But when we want that spike off. So they're generally the ones. This person is very good, but once they start having any bit of anaerobic involvement, it starts shooting up very quickly. And what we do is by training over time, we get this moving of the curve to the right. So our heart rate will always be constant. That's why I'm saying, while people get tests done regularly, if you ever just got one test, you would have a rough idea of your heart rates forevermore, because this gives you, where am I putting myself over here? This gives you like your VO2 max percentage, like how much you're breathing. This will give you your heart rate. That will always be constant. Your heart rate's always going to be roughly the same. You feel 80%, it's going to be whatever your 80% is. But the thing that will change is how much lactic you generate at certain speeds. And this is a bike test, but it would be the same for a running test. So initially you can see the red, where the threshold would have spiked much earlier, even at, say, the same heart rate. So it would have spiked much earlier. And then we would have got to, say, I would put their lactic threshold. Different people will put the numbers slightly differently, but the concept is the same. It's like, at what point do you think that person is now stressing their aerobic system with some anaerobic component? So they really want to improve that, say, zone 2 here. And then when they get to 4, they are now, anything above that is just, any additional increase is purely anaerobic. Okay, and we can work out the heart rates then for, say, aerobic or lactate threshold, and then anaerobic threshold, or sometimes called lactic threshold as well. It can be a little bit confusing. You can see here with the blue, this would be their second test, that they can stay 100% aerobic for longer, that where they were, where that person was, say, their lactic threshold, say at 300 watts, or that might be at like 12 kilometers an hour. Now they can go, say, to 320 watts. Okay, so they can go to 320 watts. Those two would roughly be the same heart rate generally. When we did it, that heart rate would kind of plot slightly differently. The heart rate probably wouldn't have changed too much, but just the speed that they can do now is a lot more. Same with the lactic threshold here. You can see that they can go a lot quicker until they hit that 4. And then they can spike. So that's what we want. We want that curve to move to the right. And we can only do that by training aerobically. You'll get better at being able to tolerate this if you train above your 4, but you won't get better at your aerobic training. Okay, so just then to conclude, like when I talk about the zones, I'm basing on that lactic threshold. Now, Cellier, he's from America, but he did a lot of work in Norway. He popularized these ideas. They were out before him, but he popularized it. They have this scale doesn't account for the individual variation that we talked about. That, you know, some people spike a bit earlier. If you know the graph, you can do them yourself. But if you just as a general rule, that they did like that, the millimoles between 0.8 and 1.5 is purely recovery. So that's recovery pace. That's just an easy run. Zone 2 generally is 75 to 85% of their heart rate max. So, but on some people, as we said, with Jonathan or even myself, that can be higher of their max heart rate. This would account for 1.5 to 2.5. And again, as we said, just some coaches I know, they use 2.2 as what they'd expect someone to be able to hit continue a marathon at, because it allows nearly maximum oxidative capacity. Because as you said, when we're in this zone, there is a little bit of anaerobic component involved. So they find that 2.2 is quite good for a marathon, allows someone to be very efficient. But again, depending on the person, this could be, we had one person that was like, say, 93%, or they might have dropped into zone 3, but they definitely weren't in VO2 max, because if they were, their times would fall off a cliff. That's that 400 meters, your legs burning pace. Okay, so, and as you said, what happens is a lot of people train here too much, but then race in these capacities and are unsure of why they're not getting the benefits they should. Their zone 3 is, well, I class zone 3 as well, so 2.5 to 4, I would keep that like 3.5. This would be closer to a half marathon type pace, like 2.6, maybe 2.8 for a half marathon pace. And then zone 4 is our lactic threshold, be the pace you could hold for like 30 to 60 minutes. Max we would be talking about is a 4 millimoles there. Again, when that big spike occurs generally, that's 90 to 95%, and then it's 88 to 93% of your VO2 max. And then zone 5 will be interval training. You wouldn't worry about your heart rate. This would be on a track or doing intervals where you're trying to hit specific times. We call this VO2 max training, where you're really just more working on running economy, trying to improve your breathing, and that's more of an interval work if you were doing that. So it just gives an idea, especially for the longer runs. When I talk about zone 2, that's what I mean. It's not based on a max heart rate, it's based on your lactate, and how we judge the lactate is where you have a slight spike, so you're really testing the aerobic system, because down here there's a lot more of the aerobic system has more to go. Once we get that little jump, that's where we know the aerobic system is really working. And if we work there in that slight jump, it trains the aerobic system to be more efficient, which then allows this to occur over time, where less lactate is produced, because you can feel that tiny bit of anaerobic, it wants to stay aerobic, so the body tries to get more efficient with her breathing, get more efficient with her running. Now, it's still important, as we said, with running economy, to do your strides, to add in some of those interval works for injury prevention, and to make sure that will also help get your body a bit more efficient. But we don't want to be doing like hands on knees, excessive running. And if people want ideas for training sessions, just put in the comments and I can do another video.